And she said, I'm a progressive. In fact, I left a place of employment because they didn't take, in my view at that time, Black Lives Matter and DEI and anti-racism seriously enough. And I wanted to work in a place that did. And I went to the new place and they started implementing it. And then I saw the darker side of it all. Mm-hmm. And then she says, I obviously October 7th had a major impact on me. And then I see your organization's Instagram posts, and which, lay out the problems with the ideology and how it affects anti-Semitism. She goes, I want to be honest with you. They resonate with me very frequently, but I never share them because I'm worried that I'll be called a racist for sharing them. Not that there's anything remotely racist about them, other than they're critiquing an ideology and how it can turn into anti-Semitism.
Thank you, everyone, for joining me today on the Yasmine Mohammed podcast. Today, my guest is David Bernstein. David, with the current alliance of the left wing allying with the anti-Semites across the globe, I felt it was a very timely time to have this discussion to talk about this phenomenon with the man who literally wrote the book on it. So his book is here. It's called Woke Antisemitism: How a Progressive Ideology Harms Jews. David is the founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, which opposes illiberal ideologies and supports liberal values in and out of the Jewish community. He's also co-founder of the Institute for Liberal Values, a consortium of like-minded organizations supporting liberal principles. Well, that's very important in this day and age. It seems that liberalism is unfortunately under attack from all sorts of places, but today we're going to specifically talk about this woke ideology. And I'm sure at some point that will intermingle with the Islamist ideology, which is also, I think, incredibly illiberal and also problematic, obviously, for the Jewish community as well as for the general, Western civilization at large. But before we get into the discussion, let's just talk about this term woke, because, it is one of those terms that everybody's got their own definition for it. So why don't you tell us both its origins and how it's perceived today? How are you using it? When you say woke anti-Semitism, what are you referring to exactly?
Yeah, interestingly, I use the term woke less and less because it's got such, supposedly problematic connotations, and people go crazy over it, like I'm appropriating a term from a marginalized community. My stepdaughter recently in conversation said to me, she's 22, said to me, that's really, woke is really cringy. So this is the title of my book. I think it's a powerful title. And I think there's a lot of people who do still use the word. They tend to use it in quotes like woke so that they don't somehow violate some social convention by using the term. The term had its origins in the Black community, going way back into like 1930s. It was often used to say, stay woke, stay aware of the threats around you. And over time, it morphed into something different. And I remember hearing it like in 2015, 2016, in a Black Lives Matter movement meeting that I was at, where people used the term to talk about sort of this social oppression that was around us, and that they were now aware, they were woke to see. That's how it was being used. And I think if you start to look at what I mean by woke ideology, and look, I mean something particular. Again, we can use a different term. It really doesn't matter to me. I mean two things by it. It's an ideology that has two tenets. One is that it sees prejudice and racism and bias not just a matter of one's personal attitude, but rather embedded in the very structures and systems of society. So the term systemic racism, for example, is the second tenet of it is that it believes that people who have the lived experience of such oppression have better insight into it than the rest of us, and therefore get to define it for the rest of society. So Black people get to define racism, Muslims, Islamophobia, women, misogyny, gay people, homophobia, Jews, anti-Semitism, perhaps not so much because we're viewed as a privileged group, but that's the rules of the game, and it's what you would call epistemology. I mean, no one likes that word because it's so technical, but it's the idea that we get our knowledge not from arguing with each other or from scientific inquiry, which is what liberalism is about, but rather from the lived experience of people who have been oppressed. And so that's the ideology I'm talking about. And look, the interesting thing is I think both of those things can be true. Like some of this ideology has insights, but the problem is it pretends to be true all the time. So for example, it can be true that there's systemic racism or systemic oppression. I don't think we should deny that. Like I think Jim Crow America was a pretty systemically racist place, right? But it's not always true. It's not always true. And not every time somebody claims systemic oppression doesn't mean it's true. It also can be true that somebody who has lived experience of minority might see something that other people don't. So I'm a Jewish person. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio in the 1970s and 80s, and I experienced anti-Semitism. There were like coins thrown at my feet. There were swastikas written into my books. And I have an experience of the anti-Semitism that if you didn't grow up that way, you might not know. But not all Jews experience anti-Semitism in the same way. Not all Jews got coins thrown at their feet. And there are other ways of determining what's true besides just lived experience. So, for example, when the Pew survey of 2019 found that American Jews are the most admired religious community, that's a data point as well that I have to take into account as I think about the levels of anti-Semitism in this country. So I think it's really important that we understand that there are some truths here, perhaps, but that the claim of that this is sort of the only way of understanding the world, that's where we get off track. That's where it sort of morphs into cancel culture. And that's what I think we have to push back against.
Yeah. And you mentioned a little bit about how Jews are perceived as the oppressors now, or they're white now, essentially. And so in this paradigm, Jews they have morphed, as I'm sure you've heard of the book from, oh gosh, I forgot his name. He's a British comedian.
David Baddiel.
That's right. David Baddiel, where he calls it Schrodinger's Jew, about like the cat, basically, how you can, depending on who's perceiving a Jewish person, are they white or not, basically. And then this paradigm that they've created is not only forgetting about or morphing or perverting people like the Jewish community, but it also does things like when you mentioned that it has nothing to do with the individuals, that it's just systemic. And so therefore, when a white person is racist towards an Asian person or the other way around, if a Black person is racist towards a Jewish person or an Asian person towards a white person or something like that, they're like, no, that can't be real because this is the structure. This is how it works.
Racism equals prejudice plus power. So if you don't have power, you really can't be a racist. And if you are perceived of having power, you can't really be a victim. And that
exactly. That's like, but this is the reality. It's like, no, it doesn't fit with my equation. So therefore it can't be true.
Exactly. I think that's the source of much of what we're talking about is you have various ethnic identities and gender identities that are mapped out on this sort of wheel of privilege, right? So either they're coded as oppressed or privileged based on that identity. And it's obviously a simplification. I was actually talking to my 19-year-old stepson. I know I'm invoking my kids a lot here about this. And he looked at me and he said something that I thought was like spot on in like a few words. He said, yeah, privilege, the idea of privilege, it's situational. And I thought, yeah, that's right. Like, okay,
Definitely.
Sometimes maybe being white gives me an advantage if I'm perceived as white. Sometimes it may not. Sometimes it even could be a disadvantage. But these things are complicated. And to reduce them down into like a binary of oppressed versus privileged is absolutely absurd and dangerous, as we've seen. And I think the problem for Jews in this matrix is that we want to desperately, a lot of Jews want to desperately be part of the oppressed class and say, well, look about our history of anti-Semitism and look at how many hate crimes are committed against us. We're the number one targeted group and blah, 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 blah. But the problem with that is that in this matrix, average household income and educational achievement are perceived as privileged. So Jews are by definition a privileged group because we have a high average income, and therefore we're either white, coded as white, or coded as white adjacent. And as a result, we're not really afforded the protection that you give the quote unquote marginalized communities. So, when there's a campus encampment and Jews are stopped from going into class and we make a fuss about it, well, you're not really oppressed. Even if they don't come out and say that, even if the university administrator hasn't thought it through, they've sort of been implicitly coding us in a certain way that means that the campus doesn't need to extend that level of protection to the Jewish student because the Jewish student is privileged. And in fact, it's even been stated explicitly. There was a group of deans at Columbia University who were gathered as part of a program they organized where the Hillel director, the Jewish Student Activities Director, was speaking to campus leaders about the plight of Jewish students. And they were texting each other saying these students are all privileged. So it's not just something that I can sort of infer from the discourse. It's something that's actually been said by not one dean, but like 3 or 4 deans who are talking to each other, which gives you tremendous insight into that mentality. And so I think that's the issue we're dealing with here, is that Jews and sometimes other minorities, Asians and others, have been coded as the oppressor, and it's very hard to get out of that because of the way that the ideology works.
Yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying, but I think there's a bigger problem. It's not just, the problem isn't that Jews are coded as the oppressors. The problem is with this whole matrix itself. This whole paradigm, this whole thing just needs to be thrown in the garbage and reworked if you need to rework it. But what you currently have here leaves out a lot of people. I mean, we could talk about people like me who are ex-Muslims, right? Like we are oppressed by, like we are minorities within minorities, right? But they don't see us as the oppressed. They see us as the oppressors. Like the whole thing is flawed in a million different ways. And probably
I couldn't agree more with that, by the way,
Yeah.
just to make that clear. Like there are a lot of Jews who want to get the Jewish experience into DEI so that we're offered those protections. I'm dead set against that. I think that because I think that the system itself is badly flawed and that we shouldn't play by those rules. That's not good for us. It's not good for society. And so, unfortunately, that's an uphill battle because a lot of Jewish organizations think it's the only game in town. And if they don't do that, the Jewish students aren't going to be protected. But I'd rather lack some of those protections in the short run and fight for what's right in the long run.
Well said. Now let's talk about one of the most dangerous parts of this ideology. So I'm going to refer to the foreword of your book, which is written by Natan Sharansky. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly. Okay, good. So it's a riveting, exceptionally riveting read because he grew up in Soviet Russia and he draws a clear line between the Marxist-Leninist ideology that killed tens of millions of people and this woke ideology that you've just described to us. So can you elaborate on that connection for us so that people can see this very clear connection?
Yeah, look. People who come from countries that experience genuine oppression and tyranny understand the difference between sort of what's offered up as oppression in this matrix and what true oppression is like. So what he's relating is what his experience growing up in the Soviet Union was, which was genuine oppression and in this sort of this binary. So imagine if you're growing up in the Soviet Union, you're taught that, there's only the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And you've been drilled in that your entire life. And you know that everything you're experiencing, whether it's anti-Semitism or just plain political repression, grows out of that Marxist ideology. And then you come to the Western world and you kiss the ground that you walk on, as he did, and you think, thank God I'm not facing that anymore. And all of a sudden you start to hear from the left in the West that very similar, maybe a slightly different. I think you could argue about whether this emerges directly out of Marxism or not, but it certainly uses the Marxist binary in its description of society. And you start to hear that and you say, this is the same old story that I've heard before. And I'm warning you because I know what this is like. I know what this means. You don't, American Jews. That's what he's saying. You don't. You might not. And you're forgiven for that. But I'm here to warn you that this binary oppressor ideology does not lead to anywhere good. That's what he's actually telling us in that. And he's urging us to take a stance against it. Even though a lot of American Jews are very want to do that for reasons we could discuss. So I think that's why his forward was so very powerful, because it emerges out of that experience of Soviet growing up. He was in the Gulag for 9 years. And he tells us, by the way, and this is so important to understand, he tells us, look, guys, in the Gulag, he doesn't say this because he's a modest man. I was in the Gulag 9 years for standing up for my principles. No one is going to disappear you in the United States for speaking your mind. So I'm challenging you to be courageous while you can, and to stand against radical ideology while you can, because even though there may be consequences, they pale in comparison to the consequences that I and other brave souls have experienced, fighting back against totalitarianism.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that's why when I was reading it, it felt so like I related to it so much, because so much of that is similar to my experience as well. I also grew up under this totalitarian ideology, a different one, but under a totalitarian ideology that is also causing such problems today. And it is also, it is also a threat to liberalism in the same way that this Marxist-Leninist woke ideology is. And just like him, I feel like I'm screaming into a void where people don't want to see the truth. Now, you said that there are a lot of Jewish people that are unwilling to recognize what he's saying. And you said we could talk about that later. Let's talk about that now. I want to understand what is preventing them from being able to see what you see and what I see.
Yeah. So some of the people I'm talking about, probably since October 7th, would acknowledge to you that they've seen what we see. I think there were a lot of people who would have denied me a platform to speak and whatever, and they still might deny me a platform to speak, even though they now realize that I might have had a point. They now see that this binary ideology was causing anti-Semitism and other problems. The question is whether they're going to do anything about it differently than they've always done. That's the problem. And I think, unfortunately, too often the answer is no. I will say that the Jewish community has particularly been tied at the hip with sort of the progressive left for a lot of reasons. I mean, the civil rights movement in America was a vehicle for Jewish liberation in this country, right? So we feel tied to the left in a way that we never did in the right. And that's different from other Jewish diaspora communities that tend not to have the same kind of deep affiliation with a particular political camp. I mean, you go to Canada in the North, and the Jews of Canada are not nearly as partisan in their own framework as we are in ours. And you find that in New Zealand, you find that in Australia, you find that in UK, so on and so forth. But American Jews have had a very distinct experience and have found safety on the center left in the Democratic Party. I think many are, now see that there are dangers that they didn't recognize before. But we have a problem, and I call it the blue state problem. Most Jews live in very blue Democratic areas. I live in Montgomery County, Maryland. In Montgomery County, Maryland, which is right outside the DC area, we have not elected a Republican for local office in like 25 years. That's how blue it is in Montgomery County, Maryland. So if you're the leader of a Jewish community, or you're a Jewish organization or a Jewish community representative, and you're thinking about what you need from, let's say, the political class, you might get security money from the local county council to provide security for synagogues in your area. You might get support for local Jewish social services from government sources. So you're tied into the political class of your local blue state area, right? And I think just give you an example, I was talking to a friend of mine who, the mainstream Jew who's in a leadership capacity. And I said, so why are you allowing this radical DEI in the school system to go unopposed? You know where it's going to lead. He said, David, I can do what you want to do, but I will alienate myself with the political class in our area, and I will lose a lot of support. You want me to do that? He's asking rhetorically, of course. So that's part of our problem, is that I think we're very deeply tied in. We have a lot of social capital that's been built up. That's not an excuse, because I still think we should move in a very different direction. But that's why new organizations like mine, the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, have to be created in order to fight that fight, because the legacy organizations are too tied up.
Yeah, so I completely hear what you're saying, and I see that as well. But it seems like, what are you offering as opposed to the Democratic Party, right? The other
Right.
option is Trump and Republicans, and they're, you know what I mean? That they're no friend to Jews either. So now what?
Yeah, Jews feel homeless, politically homeless in many ways. I'm just telling you right now, I feel politically homeless. I'm a sort of center-left, moderate, liberal, whatever. You could go through the list of policy positions and I would check off a lot of boxes. I've even taken some of those online surveys that tell me that I'm still a liberal. And yet I'm feeling deeply concerned with the direction of the Democratic Party, deeply concerned about the sort of resurgence of the left, which I think is becoming more and more powerful in the Democratic Party, not just in social institutions, but politically as well. I fear that. In some ways, I fear what's happening on the left more than I fear that's happening on the right, which is a change, by the way. Because I think even when I wrote this book, if you look at the book in the sort of introduction, I say that anti-Semitism on the right is like a heart attack, and anti-Semitism on the left is like cancer. In other words, it's slower moving, but still it can be ultimately deadly. And yet, I have to now. I would say that anti-Semitism on the left is like a heart attack too.
Yeah,
I can't say that anymore. Like, it wasn't violent in 2022, at least not the way it's been since October 7th. And now I think if we're honest with ourselves, we have to say that anti-Semitism on the left is probably more of a real and present danger than anti-Semitism on the right.
it is,
And so
because they have more power.
Yeah, they have more cultural power. But again, that doesn't make me that doesn't make me not worried about the right. Like, I know a lot of people then will say, okay, well, the right is my friendlier place, so I'm going to then find comfort there. I don't think that either political camp offers us safe harbor, and that's why I think we have to build our own. And I don't mean just Jews; I mean Jews and Asians and Indians and Muslims and ex-Muslims who are, and African Americans who also don't want their kids to be told that the system is rigged against them. We have to make common cause with each other and stand up for these democratic Western American values.
Yeah, I love that. And I co-founded an organization similar to the ones that you've founded. It's called the Clarity Coalition. And it's a coalition of people from all over the world, from all sorts of different ethnic and religious backgrounds and political backgrounds as well. And we're all concerned about the problem of Islamists and how they are trying to erode liberal values in the West. So I hear what you're saying, and I live in that, politically homeless space in between the two parties, along with you, feeling the same frustration. And, like a lot of people have said, I didn't leave the left left me, like what we used to think of as the left or classical liberals or, that shifted. We're still where we were, but all of a sudden everything has shifted towards the more, actual left, the Marxist-Leninist left. And we're like, whoa, we never signed up for this. But now the question is, do we stay within the Democratic Party and fight to pull it back? Or have things already been pulled too far and I don't think that going to the right is necessarily the answer either. We're all kind of frustrated in this space in between, like, yeah, let's start our coalitions, let's start our groups, let's start our communities. But boots on the ground, what does that mean? Does that mean Kennedy Jr.? What does it mean? I
Not
don't
for me.
know. Yeah.
Yeah, look, I don't have any easy answers to this. I spoke to a group of mostly Jews in the Catskill Mountain Resort a few weeks ago, and they were all really intellectually curious people, very, very thoughtful, and a number of them were just stuck in this very uncomfortable place. And and some of them kept on asking me, "Tell me what to do," and I'm like, "No, I can't, because I don't know what to do." but I think I know in the long run that we have to build these coalitions. Look, people are going to vote who they vote for, and you're going to vote for the lesser evil. I so desperately want them both to lose badly, but that's not going to happen. So you're going to vote for the lesser evil as you see it. And that's all fine. In the end of the day, I think we're going to have to, as Leo Leibowitz said, be the cool kids ourselves and throw our own party. And whoever comes and make it really exciting, and over time people will come. That's sort of my larger attitude about this, knowing that it won't extricate me from the current existential angst that we're all describing.
Yeah. And I think another answer, which is from your book as well, is, you talked about meeting up with these two women for coffee that, they went like 60 blocks away from their place of business to come and meet you, because they didn't want to be seen by any friends or coworkers or anything like that. They didn't want to be seen speaking to David Bernstein. And you were very empathetic, towards them for their human need for belonging and community and all that stuff. But of course, you're still frustrated with their cowardice. And it's essentially those people who support your ideas. There's a lot of them, people who support your ideas, but they're too afraid to utter them themselves. And I'd say even after October 7th, although that number may have dwindled a bit, that's still a shockingly large number. And I'm saying this because of all the messages that I receive privately, where people won't say anything publicly on this topic. And, I want to go back to Natan, where he has where he speaks in his book about what you just mentioned there. But unlike in the Soviet Union, you could be arrested by the KGB like he was. You're in America. You're in the freest country in the world. Nobody's going to put you in solitary confinement like I was. So, I can only imagine the disappointment and probably the disgust he feels having to witness this cowardice in the freest country in the world. I know I feel it. I'm speaking to people from Afghanistan and Iran and Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, like incredibly brave dissidents. And they are up against knives, bullets, executions, beheadings. And then I've got people in the United States of America saying to me, but somebody might call me a mean word. And I just feel like shaking them and saying, you don't recognize how privileged you are, that you don't have to care, that all they have is mean words. Let them say their mean words. Who cares? You know what I mean? Find your strength, find your bravery. How do you feel about this? What is your message to those folks?
Yeah. Well, first of all, early on in my starting this institute, the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, I realized that we weren't in the anti-woke business. We were in the courage business. And so we had to learn how to make people more courageous. I have just a story from yesterday. Yesterday, I was speaking to a young Jewish woman who is in the educational space and doing some work in the educational space. And she said, I'm a progressive. In fact, I left a place of employment because they didn't take, in my view at that time, Black Lives Matter and DEI and anti-racism seriously enough, and I wanted to work in a place that did. And I went to the new place, and they started implementing it, and then I saw the darker side of it all. Mm-hmm. And then she says, I obviously October 7th had a major impact on me. And then I see your organization's Instagram posts, and which, lay out the problems with the ideology and how it affects anti-Semitism. She goes, I want to be honest with you. They resonate with me very frequently, but I never share them because I'm worried that I'll be called a racist for sharing them. Not that there's anything remotely racist about them, other than they're critiquing an ideology and how it can turn into anti-Semitism. I think that's, par for the course. That's what I experienced. I'm sure that's what you experienced as well. So what does it mean to be in the courage business? Well, I have a couple core principles that I found work, not all the time. Nothing works all the time, but a lot of the time. One is I like to call the question. I meet with people. They tell me that they're sick and tired of this. And then I say, well, would you do X? There was one former colleague of mine who runs a Jewish organization, and she says, I 100% agree with you. So, well, would you have me speak? Let me think about it. Okay, I'll have you speak. Then I speak. Would you consider posting the pictures of it on Facebook? Let me think about it. Okay, I'll let you do that. I'll do that. Would you post about it in the listserv of the professional network that you're part of? Think about it. She does it. Okay, but I had to actually ask for something directly, and each time to get her to sort of do it and become comfortable with it. Now I think once she's done it, she's willing to do it again, and she's not as afraid. But sometimes you have to sort of venture out there for yourself. So that's one of the core principles I have is called the question. I talk people through the consequences. That's another thing that I often do. So there was a teacher who came to hear me speak at a synagogue who said, you're not going to believe what they're teaching in my school system. I said, well, can I see it? Yeah, and let me think about it. And we talk about it, and he said, I'm very nervous about going public with any of this. I said, so let me just ask you, what makes you afraid? He takes a deep breath and he says, I'm worried that Antifa is going to show up at my doorstep. I said, listen, I've been doing this publicly at that time for like 2 years. I've written a book about it, and no one from Antifa has showed up at my doorstep. And he sort of took a deep breath and he realized that, of course, he was catastrophizing. Mm-hmm. And he then took the chance. So we have to provide permission structure for people to be courageous. We have to encourage them to be courageous, and push them to be courageous. And I think that's what we're all trying to do in a way is to expand the ranks of the courageous. So I think that's a really important. But again, I still get a lot of private Facebook messages. We have a long way to go.
Yeah. But building these coalitions are important for that, because we stand alone. Like, it's not going to just be you, David Bernstein, standing alone, sticking your neck out, posting these things, and then having to deal with the attacks, but you have a coalition of people around you. Together we are stronger. So finding like-minded people and building these communities, I think is a really great step towards that bravery. So that's a really good thing. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about schools. So you work in the K-12 sphere quite a bit, and I have a lot of parents who approach me all the time, whether, most are in America, but in Europe as well, and in Canada, of course, who are nervous about September and how things are going to, how things could erupt again. So could you talk to us a little bit about that in your experience? What are some thoughts that you have on that?
Yeah, so we are really pivoting toward K-12 education because we think it is the most important sphere that's not being attended to by other organizations and groups. Not that there aren't Jewish groups, for example, and others that aren't working on it. There's some very good ones. But the problem is that at least in the Jewish community, they just oppose the obvious, explicit anti-Semitism, but they won't oppose the underlying radical ideology that's producing the anti-Semitism. And so that's what we're trying to get parents to do. We're trying to get them to do it in coalition with other groups as well. This is not just an assault on Jews, it's an assault on American and Western values. And understanding that reality reframes the kind of posture that we take toward the problem. One thing that we're doing, we're developing a tool with another organization for parents, and we're asking them, look, there's a series of terms that you have to learn to recognize that might serve as an early warning system. I mean, if you hear the word liberatory education, I can promise you that's nothing like the word liberal. It is this sort of neo-Marxist framework. If there's and we just did, one of my colleagues, Mika Hackner, wrote a piece that's going to be out shortly called like 18 terms to look out for in your kids' education. And I could go through some of them, but these are terms that tell you that there's a problem. And the problem that we're having, again, is this has become deeply embedded in the very structure of the school system. To use the kind of woke analysis that I did, it has become deeply embedded. Let me give you an example of this. In New York City schools, Mayor Michael Bloomberg had really reformed the schools to a large degree and set up performance standards for the school system that would allow schools to improve over the course of years. His successor, de Blasio, came in and scrapped that whole thing and replaced it with a disparities framework. So now you're no longer measuring school performance or student performance. You're measuring, was the school able to narrow disparity between the students of different racial categories. And that ushers in an entire bureaucracy of ideologues who are now empowered to run the school system. And so you can't really win on extremism in schools. I don't think in the long run. You might be able to win some battles, but you're not going to win the war as long as that's the case. I think we've got to sort of buckle down and get ready for a much longer fight and fight for those things. It's not easy, by the way. Like, there's this term, the long march through institutions, right? That was coined in the late 1960s about how these radicals were going to take over American institutions. Remarkably successful. We may have a shorter march than their march, but it's not going to be overnight. And it's not going to be 1 year, and it's not going to be 5 years. We're going to have to really get ready for a long struggle where we lose a lot until we start to win. And things can change really suddenly. The term DEI, no one ever heard of a year ago. And now all of a sudden, everybody knows what DEI is. I know this, by the way, because we polled on certain terms like critical race theory, DEI, anti-racism, and the like. No one heard of DEI before. Now they do. So things can change. We can get the upper hand in ways that we didn't before. But we have to be in this in the long term. And so I think there's a lot to do with parents. I think parents can lobby their school boards. They can run for school board, by the way. That's something we're going to be really emphasizing. We're going to create a school board institute. We're going to go deep in certain areas. The 4 cities that we're going to start with are Philadelphia area, Chicago area, New York City area, and the San Francisco Bay Area. And we're going to hire staff in each of those places to do this work at a local level, really working with and through parents. But I'm telling them from the get-go, I mean, you might want what every foundation wants, key performance indicators and metrics and all that. And you'll get them, but they're not going to be overnight. It's going to take us a while to get there.
That's great. These are some really good, practical, proactive tools that you're sharing with people so that we can feel less like victims of this and frustrated and angry, but instead we're going to just actively get involved, learn those 18 terms, pay attention, join the PTA, you know what I mean, get involved. So that's really great. That's really good advice. So I'm going to open it up to everybody here now. The chat has just been going crazy and I haven't been able to pay attention to it. But I would ask that you please raise your hand if you have a question for David, or if you want me to read your question out. If you prefer not to read it, then please copy and paste it again because I didn't get a chance to see them. Tochi, you're up.
Hey, Yasmine. What's up, everybody? So I happen to be driving at the moment, so I'll keep it brief. David, how you doing, brother?
Great to see you.
The question is, I wonder, do you believe that Jews in general had a big hand in actually creating DEI? And I ask this question because And ironically, in a sense, it's come back to bite the Jewish community in the ass. But I ask this because when I look at, like, for example, with Harvard and the whole, the Pritzker situation, how, Pritzker nominated Claudine Gay and, this kind of stuff. Do you think that the Jewish community had some hand in trying, and I'm not saying from a malicious perspective, I actually think that their intentions were probably in the right place, but helping to sort of create this idea behind DEI, but not realize that in essence, it was setting up a framework that could be used against them. I'm just curious what you think about that.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for the question. I think that there was no organized, look, I've been part of the organized mainstream center-left Jewish advocacy world my entire career. I worked for these institutions. And I can tell you, I never once saw an effort to try to get DEI installed into the, social institutions, businesses, and the like. There were, as there always are, Jews involved in the DEI enterprise from its early days. I'm friendly with a man named Howard Ross, who is a very nationally known figure within DEI. Howard was the DEI practitioner whose contracts were canceled when Trump came to office and said that all federal governments must end the practice of DEI. So he lost all his business at that time. That's how prominent he was in the DEI field. But he's been around since like the 1980s in its very infancy. And he will tell you that the problem is that DEI never had a shared definition. So it allowed all kinds of radical practitioners to come in and claim that they were doing DEI and the like. Now, I don't think that everything that Howard did was that open-minded as well. Like I'm critical of his form of DEI too. I think it also played into the oppressor binary more than maybe he would admit. But but in general, I think it just opened a Pandora's box to all sorts of people. I think the Jewish community's instincts were to see this as sort of the next iteration of the civil rights movement and to sort of go along with it because they didn't want to be at odds with their traditional partners. But I don't think it really emerged out of the Jewish world. I think it emerged out of a very distinct segment of sort of DEI corporate people, people who had studied postmodernism in college and sought to translate that. It emerged out of the critical race theory framework, by the way, which was very different than the liberal framework. And so, yeah, were there Jews involved in critical race theory? There absolutely were. Were there Jews involved in postmodern doctrine? Absolutely were. Was it sort of a product of the mainstream Jewish world? I don't think so at all.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'd add to that, too, that there are a lot of anti-Zionist Jews who jumped on this bandwagon, if not, led the way. So it is unfortunate that we did see a lot of that. And it's very frustrating. I think after October 7th, we're seeing less of it, thankfully. But it drives me crazy to see it. Again, those are more people that I just want to shake and say, like, pay attention to what's going on around you.
Yeah, and if I can just add real briefly, I was going to say, I agree with obviously both of you. And I'm all for diversity. I'm a Black man, obviously, and I love the Jewish community. I love all people in general. I grew up in Saudi, as you know, and I say this a bunch of times. So, I got love for my Arabs as well, Bedouins. I've had all kinds of experiences in life. I think that DEI is really fascinating in a way because on the surface it appears to, attack or take care of the diversity issue, but I find that it's actually, in a way, ironically, very anti-diverse. It's certainly anti-diverse of opinions, which by nature would shut out whole groups of cultures and people. And I find DEI to actually be like uphold white supremacy in a really weird way. Anyways, that's just my opinion.
Thank you. Agreed.
Yeah, agree as well. Rachel, you're next.
Hi, Yasmine. Hi, David. Thank you so much.
Hi, Rachel.
I resonated with a lot of what you said. And one of the things that I have been thinking a lot about, since October is like this idea of Jews being safe. And voting for the political party that promises them safety. And in, my own family history, my great-grandparents lived in Ukraine, and I have family members who were murdered in the pogroms which took place after the fall of the Russian Tsar, which the Jews were blamed for. And the Jews were called Bolsheviks. They were called communists. They were massacred. And there really was a genocide of up to 200,000 Jews because they were Jews, because they thought they were communists. And everybody killed them, like the Ukrainian nationalists, the Tsarists, the Polish. And the only people who offered them protection were the Bolsheviks. And the Jews, while they were not ideologically married to the Bolshevik party, and they didn't believe in what the Bolsheviks believed in, which was, atheism and socialism, they chose to ally themselves with that party because that party promised to keep them safe. They were against pogroms. They persecuted anti-Semitism. You could not speak things that were anti-Semitic even without being prosecuted for it. But eventually, after World War II, the communists turned on the Jews too. So we Jews don't really have a safe place. And we have to remember that our safety is very temporary and transient. And in any society that's not working actively on educating itself and values education and truth, we're the first victims, to fall prey to that. So I feel like in terms of the presidential race, pretty hopeless. But at the same time, I see in the Republican Party a lot of actual policies that protected Jews in America, not just in the Middle East, but, adding Jewish protections to Title IX legislation. And then Trump wants to stop funding universities that don't condemn anti-Semitism. But that figurehead and the ideology behind it, the one who's promising that, is something I'm totally against. At the same time, the left party is catering to Islamists and pandering to them, and not even coming out and speaking out against them, not even coming out and speaking out strongly against anti-Semitism in the party. So what do you recommend? I think maybe in terms of local politics, what should we advocate for in ways, places that we can control? What do we do where in spaces that are smaller, because on a national level, things are spinning out of control?
Yeah. This first, the larger issue, I think Jews have always had a two-part test of a society that they're in about whether they're in danger. We have a pretty good danger alert system that has sometimes failed us, particularly, by the way, when it comes to left-wing anti-Semitism and communism. When people promise universal salvation, we tend to forget that they can be threats to us. But we look at this as, I think we look at the threat in two ways. One, is it an obvious threat that's directed against us or Israel or whatever? That's number one. The other is this political party leader ideology threatening the fundamental liberal values and freedoms that would allow Jewish communities to thrive? And I think you can look at either party and worry about it on both fronts. So, you just have to sort of rate it yourself. I think at the local level, there's a lot we can do. Look, I think schools are, as we were saying, are really an important battleground, and they're largely, not always, it depends where you are, being captured by ideological forces. There are teachers unions that, I'm a fan of teachers unions traditionally. I want teachers to be paid more and the like, but teachers unions that have been sort of taken over by really extremist forces. So I think we've got to fight that. I think that's a great place to do it. And I would organize a lot more thoughtful people who care about these values: Jews, Asians, Muslims, ex-Muslims, African Americans, and others, to get involved in school boards and school board elections, so that we can start to shift the consensus within these school systems.
Thank you, David. You good, Rachel? Okay. All right. So there's quite a few questions in the chat that people want me to read to you that I think are maybe very related to what you just said. So I'm just going to read them out for you anyway. So the first one asks, how do we deal with entrenched woke ideology in government? So example, in Canada, the Conservative Deputy Opposition Leader, Melissa Lantsman, revealed at a parliamentary hearing that Global Affairs Canada, so it's our Foreign Affairs Ministry, put out a 100-page anti-racism training manual called Dismantling Racism. In that training manual, it says, Jews have opted to become white in order to benefit from white supremacy. So that same question with frustrations with the government. Yeah. I don't know if you have an answer to that.
Yeah, I do. First of all, I want to tell you, we are doing an event in Toronto on September 22nd. It'll be, I think, 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. If you are interested in learning more, email me at david@jilv.org. That's david@jilv.org. I'll share it with you. I'll share the publicity with you, because we see the threat in Canada as even more acute than it is in the United States. There's no counterbalancing force in Canada as there in the US, right? And as a result, it just sort of spreads like wildfire. Recently the Toronto School District adopted something like called anti-Palestinian racism, APR, which is basically it basically says that that questioning the Palestinian narrative, like of the Nakba, the disaster, is a form of anti-Palestinian racism. And I think we've got to be aware of these trends. These trends are constantly morphing. Like, I can give you the 18 terms to look out for, but I guarantee you this time next year, when we're about ready to start the school, it's going to be a different set of terms, because they're constantly using language in a way that that is meant to confuse people and confound. And so we have to be aware of that. That's the newest, the latest and greatest is APR. So that's coming right out of Toronto in Canada. And some of the worst trends that we see are not even anymore originating in California, which is their traditional home. Thank you, Mars. But Mars Chung, who's back there and friend, but rather in places in Toronto and other places in Canada, but particularly Toronto.
Yeah. So I'm going to get to you in a second, Mars. I'm just going to ask this quick question here. In addition to running for school boards, how can we impact teachers' unions? They seem to be more powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would make concerted efforts, and some are doing it, to find all the Jewish teachers, Asian teachers, others, teachers who have maybe more politically conservative leanings. Any way you can find your friends and bring them into a block of support. That's what I would do. There have been some success stories. I mean, there was some really bad stuff coming down the pike where I live in Montgomery County, Maryland, outside of the DC area, and a group of teachers organized themselves and defeated it within the union. So I think we don't always have to lose. We don't have to take that for granted. But teacher unions have been largely taken over a period of time. I think we've got to get thoughtful people into leadership positions in these unions. We might lose a few battles along the way, but that's the long-term ticket for this.
Thank you. Mars.
Thank you, Yasmine. David, hope you're doing well. It's been a while.
Yeah.
I have a question here, but I like to get just a little brief, just a little context. Back in the 1960s, we saw a major political shift from the constituency of the Republican Party and the Democrats because of some of the stances that Barry Goldwater took. And given how toxic and how widespread woke ideology is today, I think we're starting to see a shift, another major realignment. It's in a very, very, very different context, but nonetheless, I do believe it's occurring. I'm someone who's center left, and again, I'm one of those individuals who can say that the left, I didn't leave the left left me. Classical liberal, all that jazz. We have a variety. Several years ago, we didn't have any organizations to push back against this. It was maddening to see. Now we have a variety of organizations coming up, and pushing back against the woke and to the extent that they're able. In some of these orgs, in some of these events you and I have both been in, we see a conglomeration of people from all over the political spectrum, from different backgrounds coming together to deal with this. But sometimes I host interviews with people to do my best to try to inform them as best as I can to see how woke ideology affects us, all from a variety of angles. I get some pushback on occasion by certain views that I bring into play. Like I did one on classical liberalism a short while ago, and there's some people who are very, very hesitant to participate in that discussion because that word liberal has unfortunately become a very dirty word. The academic meaning of it is lost. Do you see these new coalitions holding, given the how fractured our institutions meant to produce knowledge are? We have so many differing opinions on a variety of different topics. I can see this fracturing people later on down the line.
Yeah.
And I still think it's
it already has to a degree. Yeah, I think the answer is yes, of course. But the people who oppose an ideology like this are likely to be people who do not play well with others all the time. We're the kind of people who are willing to say our view no matter what. And as a result, we don't necessarily form easily into coalitions and political movements because that means making compromises on your own perspectives in order to work with others. And that's always been a problem in the sort of nascent liberal movement, if you want to call it that, or we can rebrand it to something else if the word liberal has become too problematic, probably has. But I think that's our issue. People don't want to compromise anything of their beliefs, and if you do, they may find fault. I think also there's this sort of phenomenon of capture, ideological capture, or audience capture, when you realize that the people who agree with you most are people who have a certain set of political views, so it's very easy to say, well, if the right likes me more than the left, I'm going to feed them red meat all the time. So Yasmine, voices like yours that don't do that don't go to that in order to capture a larger market share are unique. And I think that to me is the challenge, is to build moderate coalition where we don't automatically go to the opposite extreme because we become so flustered with our own ideological camp, that we continue to walk the tightrope. How many of us are there? Well, it may not take that many. Look, and sometimes I'm astounded at how impactful a small group of leftist ideologues were in pushing their agenda. So we may be a small group too, the people who are willing to sort of stand outside either political and ideological camp and stand for what we believe is right, but we can be mighty just as they were mighty. And I think that's our role. That's the role that's been given to us, and that's the role we should do, and try to compromise where we can. We have to become a more mature political movement. And that means, being willing to play politics and not condemn everyone in our own coalition because they deviate from us 10%. I mean, I've seen a lot of that, that kind, guys, kind of extend the principle of charity to the other people. These are people that you need, and you can't just, slam them because they disagree with you on some point here. Work with people where you can agree on, 60% of it and let some of it pass. So that, I think we've got a lot of work to do to sort of, and Mars, I know you've been in this, to sort of pass those norms into our own body politic as best we can. But we're still new, and we need to become more mature.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, David. So I'm going to read you a question here from someone who doesn't want to come on camera. She says, many people work in woke companies where their jobs could be at stake if they speak out. So David, have you thought about setting up a coalition of lawyers, or are you familiar with a coalition of lawyers who are willing to defend people who are dismissed as a result of standing up to woke ideology? I think knowing that there is a support network will liberate many to speak out. So I would extend this to teachers in
Yeah.
in K to 12 or even in post-secondary.
Right. Look, I mean, I think it's a brilliant idea. We're not doing that. I'm not doing that, not because it's not important, but because I have other things to do that are important too. This field needs to do exactly that kind of thing. Someone needs to come in and organize lawyers, without a doubt. There are people who are organizing doctors, by the way. Let's do that too. But I think lawyers are key. The American Bar Association sort of went down the woke rabbit hole, and I think there needs to be lawyers that push back against that. So, yes, we need more of that kind of constituency organizing. There are people sort of within the anti-woke movement who are like, why are you just talking about anti-Semitism and Jews? I think basically Jews do well when society does well and don't do well when society doesn't do well. And I want society to thrive. It's not just about the Jewish community. Of course, I want the larger society to adhere to its principles, but I understand that there's a particular problem when the way this ideology plays out with Jews. And I want to organize Jews as a constituency of support for these liberal values. And so we have to do this sort of constituency-based approach. And I think that lawyers are one such place, and I think lawyers would be extremely valuable if they organized and lent their legal support to people who are facing all kinds of problems in the workplace. So I'm all for it.
Great, thank you. Ira, you've got a really good statement here. I hope that you will raise your hand and tell David that yourself. In the meantime, Cindy, you're next.
Hello, thank you. And thanks, David, for your talk. I actually have your book ordered, and unfortunately it hasn't arrived yet, so I haven't really had a chance to read it, but I am looking forward to it. And I guess I have so many things that have come up for me. I'm having a hard time figuring out where to start. I don't know that I have really a specific question, but I'm really, really concerned about literally being stuck in a middle that I don't know what to do with. I feel like coming from the extreme left, there's a threat to me as a Jewish American woman. I feel like as even coming from the extreme right, there's also a real threat to me. Maybe not specifically Jewish as much as non-Christian and, as a woman. And I'm trying to figure out how to balance all of that, because I feel like, when I think about what woke means to me, in terms of how I define it, my problem with it is I see it as being a bunch of white people who think they know it all, trying to tell other white people how they should relate to other people that they view as either being oppressed or disadvantaged. And they don't always listen to what the so-called disadvantaged people are saying, and they place all kinds of labels. And, I feel like the left at this point is allied more with the Islamists that, in their anti-Zionism specifically are the epitome of anti-Semitism. And but also on the right, you have the Christian nationalists who, they may, talk about the Judeo-Christian ethic or, kind of allying Jews with Christians. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, it's a Christian nationalist sort of imposing sort of like the white Christian patriarchal, whatever on everybody. So I don't know. Again, I don't really have a specific question about it, but it's funny because I'm not especially religious, but I've never been so aware of being Jewish and being sort of like stuck in this middle where different people are trying to tell me, what I should or shouldn't believe, and and feeling like I don't agree with anybody on so many different things.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, so I feel, yeah, number one. Number two, you had mentioned that sometimes the sort of woke left misrepresents minority communities. And there was a recent poll that I saw about what do you prefer, race-conscious policies or race-blind policies? And overwhelmingly, African Americans, among others, preferred race-blind policies. In other words, they weren't the sort of woke proposition did not represent their views on the world. They were not after that. I mean, it was a significant minority. It was something over a third, but it was a clear majority too. And so I think that we allow dominant voices and sort of with an asymmetry of passion to represent an entire group of people or misrepresent an entire group of people. Look, I agree with everything you said about both the threats on the left and the right. And I think we're going to have to learn to be comfortable with the discomfort, to live with the discomfort. Maybe not comfortable, but, that's where we are. That's what the world is providing us, and I think we should get used to it and then do our best to try to build our own 30-yard line to 30-yard line, center left to center right coalition. But it's going to take a while, and we're in the early stages of it. And in the meantime, that's your plight and mine.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. I'm going to read you this comment from Ira. I was hoping that he'd come and speak on it himself because I'm not entirely. Oh, good. Okay, go ahead. Please tell us what you're saying here because I'm not entirely.
I'm not clear. I'm sorry.
Sure. No, I'm not entirely sure if I agree with you. So, but go ahead and try. Okay,
That's
go
fine.
ahead.
I suspect a lot of us here have left the left in various years and decades. I left it 55 years ago.
Wow.
And probably most of us said for a while that it's the left that left us. And probably most of us realized, no.
But you were on the actual left, though.
That was called the New Left.
Yeah.
Okay.
In the late 1960s. So what was the reality? We had all signed on to it. And then said, no, it's something we hadn't signed on to. But we had always signed on. We signed on to deceiving society as to what we were about when that seemed useful and necessary because society wasn't ready for it in our ideology. We all signed on to deceiving one another, gaslighting one another as to what we were about. We were always signed on to vilifying our society and calling it every dirty name in the book, what later became the basket of deplorables. There were some new ones added in the 2010s, but it was the same thing back in the 1960s, basically. And not hearing anyone on the other side because they were bad people a priori. We were always all about making it cool to be attacking our society and the thing the intelligent people do and undermining it and what later came to be called deconstructing it. And we were in various stages of progression and progressivism toward this. And we pretended to have nothing to do with communists. But of course, we had something to do with communists and we were supporting the Viet Cong. And we were saying, oh, they're not the North Vietnamese. But of course they were. And so some of us simply got sick of that and then blamed the left for leaving us and said we hadn't signed on. And most of us have concluded that's not true. There's a grain of truth always that we hadn't signed on to the whole thing quite 100% consciously. And so we got sick of it. But anyone can say that, frankly. And the reason I left is I didn't lying about what we're about. I didn't like deceiving society. I didn't like vilifying my fellow classmates with all the basket of deplorables terms that we had back then and shutting their thoughts out of my mind. I don't see anything fundamentally new today. I do see a shifting terrain in the ideological wars, and it's dangerously worse today than it's been ever since the 1960s, maybe even worse today than it was then. And the embrace of anti-Semitism is far more extreme and open than it was, but it began already in the 1960s as the Soviets were turning more and more openly to anti-Semitism. So it's.
I'm
sorry,
I hear you.
That's my conclusion.
I hear you, Ira. I hear you. Let me respond. First of all, I think there's a kernel of truth to what you say, but just a kernel. I think that yes, there have been streams of the far left who have been partially integrated into the larger center left for decades, and you can see this in the 1960s discourse, and you can see it since. And it's been. I remember in the 1980s when I was a college student, there were those voices. They were different than my voice, by the way, and they were different than my brand of liberalism. Not every right-winger, by the way, signs up for the most extreme right just because those voices have been part of the right forever. There's always been the alt-right in the right. There's always been those extremist voices, but they don't define all of the right. Let me just give you a sense of the departure that I've sensed here. When Betty White died, the actress, at nearly 100 years old, my wife started watching old episodes of the Golden Girls. And the B. Arthur character was talking to her mother, Sophia, who was born in Italy, and said, and gave her this lecture on what American meant to her and how she put the flag into her hand. It was this beautiful characterization of the American dream. This was a liberal show of its time. It was a progressive show. It was of its time. The discourse was so different than anything that you would hear today. And I remember how, when I was listening to my wife as she was listening to Golden Girls, how quaint that struck me and how much the discourse actually had shifted. When I grew up in the 1980s, the dominant left believed that there were haves and have-nots. But we didn't have a solution. We didn't have a theory as to why there were have-nots. We just knew that there were, and that we should do everything we can to sort of narrow the gap. It wasn't an ideological proposition. Well, I always knew that there were people who were saying there are haves and have-nots, and the haves have caused the deprivations of the have-nots. I always knew that was part of the mix. It wasn't part of the stream that I was from, and so. And by the way, I didn't just suddenly say the left left me. In 2001, I wrote an extensive memo to my colleagues saying, I'm hearing some very dangerous stuff from our own ideological camp, that I think if that becomes dominant, we're in trouble, and that we should push back against it. I wrote about it in an op-ed in 2003 as well. I've been talking about this for 20-some years while I maintained my station on the center left. So I don't agree with you, Ira, in some fundamental way that I agree with you in one sense. It's always been there. It has become far more dominant, and you can say the exact same thing about the right.
I'll agree with 2/3 of that. It's always been there. It's gotten a lot worse. It's developed, and I would say since the 60s, it's developed from generation to generation, like a shifting graph, but secularly moving up in every cycle. And all the times we say, oh, that's over. No, it got worse. I would say in the 80s, it was worse than the 60s because it became political correctness. That's a further development on the repressive tolerance of the 1960s.
Yeah, I agree it's gotten worse.
Woke is the latest version of political correctness. It is a rebranding of political correctness with a bit of the consciousness-raising language of the 60s.
I agree.
I agree with you. There's nothing fundamentally new. Where I disagree is the parallelism with the right being a symmetry that is practically and morally equivalent. Morally, it's distinct on both sides, and practically, I agree with those who say the overwhelming danger today is from the left, and that has been primarily true always since 1945, when the far right was resoundingly defeated.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah. Some good things to think about and to do some self-reflection. I hear a lot of truth in what you're saying as well. David, we've got some questions here from people about the event in Toronto. So how can people participate? Are there other details that you want to share with us right now? We've got a lot of Canadians. I'm Canadian.
Right.
And as you mentioned, in Canada, we've got some big problems, and there is no pushback. We do not have a counterbalance. So you're going to have,
Yeah, I'm
it's going
going
to be
to
well
pull up.
attended.
I'm going to pull up a flyer. Let's see. Here's a save the date flyer. Okay, so I can read from it. Okay, it's going to be called The New Anti-Semitism, What It Is, How to Fight It. The truth is we're trying to change the frame of it, by the way, just so you know. We want people to understand that this is an assault on Western values, and that's written, that's part of what we're doing. It's going to be at the Proserman Jewish Community Center, 4588 Bathurst Street in Toronto at the Leah Postlins Theater. We're going to have different panels. One of them is with Barbara Kay, the columnist for National Post, and her son, Jonathan Kay, who's an editor for Quillette that many of us know. And they haven't always agreed, but they do agree now. And so we're going to be looking at, how this overall ideological framework must be opposed, and trying to build a constituency in Canada. So we're sending this out soon, and there will be sort of a registration, but just feel free to email me, and I'll make sure that we add you to the list and that you're invited. I should say though, this is not actually open to the public, but because we have a defined number of seats there, but so it's not for everybody to receive, but if anybody who's part of this conversation, you can count on, we'll invite you. So just
Wonderful.
Email me, david@jilv.org.
Great. Thank you so much, David. I really appreciate you extending the invitation out to my community here. They are all wonderful people. I can vouch for every single one of them. They're all good people. So I really appreciate that. And it is really great to have a place where you can meet like-minded people, speak about your frustrations, share what's on your heart and mind without feeling like you have to be careful of your words and add the caveats, and people are going to judge you and people are going to insult you. So that's really effective. And I love that you're very proactive in all of your work, that you have like specific tools and ideas and practical things that people can do to fight back. I really appreciate that a lot.
Thank you.
Before I let you go, I just want to make sure that there isn't something that you wanted to talk about that you haven't had a chance to talk about, or any final words of advice, parting words of wisdom for us to conclude our conversation.
I don't. I just urge you all to continue to be courageous. Obviously, you're on this discussion, and you must be already. And reach out. I'd love to know. I'm always happy to talk to anybody, by the way, because I found some of the most incredible allies through sort of one-on-one conversations over Zoom. So please feel free to reach out, and look forward to working with you all.
Thank you. Thank you again. Thank you so much, David. I'm definitely going to be reaching out and asking you to join the Clarity Coalition, because I think that we are just like you. We are concerned about these threats to Western values, mostly coming from anti-Semites and Islamists. So yeah, we're doing similar work, and so we should all, support each other. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you very much for your time, David. Take care, everyone.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
After hearing all that, you might be left wondering, what can I do? How can I help? Well, this is why I created a nonprofit called Free Hearts, Free Minds. We are the only organization dedicated exclusively to helping these free thinkers. We empower them with our programs and supportive community, lifting them up so they can heal, speak out, and begin to make positive changes, not just in their own lives, but within the broader community around them. If this is a cause that resonates with you and you want to make a difference, one way to do that is by donating to Free Hearts, Free Minds. Because not enough people care about this cause, we need people like you to help fuel this change. You can donate via our website, freeheartsfreeminds.com. Thank you. Every dollar you donate makes a difference.